Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Wednesday, January 29th, 2025, and today we're talking about perennial cover crops, how the ice is finally melting here, so game on, kinda. And we need to talk about weeds in the garden and why I'm never really going to suggest that you just leave them there. So let's do it. All right, y'all. Well, welcome to Wednesday. We did it. I stayed up a little late watching the UK game last night, but it was well worth it, it turns out. So go Cats. And by late, I mean 9 p.m. But it's finally started to thaw here, which is exciting. I mean, for almost an entire month straight, the ground has been covered in ice, which has meant some embarrassing falls for me and very little farm work. Which, as you can probably imagine, complicates this job a little bit because finding farm stuff to talk about is an amusing challenge when there is no farming going on. I have not even been able to access our compost pile, so our kitchen scraps got a little out of control on the porch. Just several buckets of frozen compost fodder waiting to be added to the pile buried beneath a sheet of ice. Everything, including my soil mix, has been frozen solid, which is, just so it's clear, not ideal. However, now that I can finally see some daylight and garden beds, let the farming begin very, very slowly. What's wild is I've never seen a full month of snowpack here in Kentucky. We almost always get some snow, but the snowfalls are usually accompanied by a warm few days, like immediately they're following, like we're having this week. But January was clearly drunk. In fact, when people from the north come down here, they marvel at how thin the roads are because we don't have to allow for any amount of snow piling. However, several people reminded me this week that the snowpack is better than mud season, which is usually what we get here, cold, wet, and muddy for 3 months straight. And if you know me, because I say it probably a lot, you know that I'm not a mud fan. Sure, I went no-till for a lot of reasons, including reduced weed pressure and better soil health and production and all that stuff. Sure, fine. But when I realized that mulching the soil and maintaining the living pathways and all that stuff meant less mud, I was sold. I've worked in muddy gardens, my own and others, and it's just the worst. Mud is awkward and heavy on the boots. It gets on everything. It gets in the house. It's not fun to work in. But all the snowpack has me wondering if there are effects that I hadn't thought of, that I hadn't witnessed here in Kentucky, bad or good, because nothing has been able to photosynthesize for like a solid month. Our garlic was even up pretty good before the ice, and I have no idea how it will react to that much coverage for that long. Usually it's up and getting frosted through that period, but it's usually not fully covered for very long. Anyway, that will be interesting to see. I don't think my overwinter leeks are going to make it, but I should know that pretty shortly. As for farm work, now that I'm kind of able to get back to it, this week is getting the peppers going, which I will detail maybe tomorrow. I will also start another round of lettuces this week with those peppers. I'm contemplating starting just a little more onions as well. We eat lots of onions. We sell lots of onions. All the onions. Not the most profitable crop, but honestly not the worst, and I like growing them. I'll probably wait another 2 weeks before I start our tomatoes because although I could start them at the same time as the peppers, they are often so big by the time I feel comfortable planting them early April that I'm often tempted to jump the gun and just go ahead and plant them. Peppers grow more slowly than tomatoes. Just makes more sense to kind of separate the two. Plus, I've read studies that show at least comparable yields and speed to production when planting smaller plants. I can't say I've studied that on any large extent, but from what we've tried, it seems to be the truth. Smaller tomato plants generally do fine for us. I've got some beds to clear from the fall in a tunnel to get ready to plant the lettuce I started a few weeks back, as you'll remember. In fact, most of what we will be planting and prepping over the next month is under protected culture, i.e. high tunnels in the greenhouse. I will not be doing any sort of field planting until March in my region of Kentucky, Zone 6B, and even then it will be pretty minimal. We will discuss restraint at some point, I'm sure, but it's often really hard when we're getting t-shirt weather days in March not to go all in on whatever's in the greenhouse and ready to go. Because the fear starts to set in that you're going to be too busy in April. It's better to wait. But our last frost date is not until May 10th, and in 2020 we hit 25 degrees Fahrenheit, that's negative 3.8 degrees Celsius, on May 12th, which was quite the semi-literal icing on the cake for that particular spring. For now, it's all about getting the last little winter projects done, getting beds prepped and ready in the tunnels, and getting things set up like irrigation that I won't have time to deal with in the season. Anyway, are you all ready for the growing season? How are you feeling? Because it's coming one way or another, unless you're in the south where it's pretty much already here, or in the southern hemisphere where it's almost over. Anyway, that's where I'm at on these things. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, take a question about clay and perennial cover crops. BRB. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Peaceful Heritage Nursery. If you're looking for hardy and resilient fruit trees, berry plants, or pawpaw trees, then check out Peaceful Heritage Nursery. Peaceful Heritage Nursery LLC is a mail-order nursery shipping premium quality fruit trees and berry plants across the USA. They specialize in resilient, non-GMO plant genetics for small growers. Their diverse selection includes berries, cold hardy figs, passion fruit, gumi, mulberry, and much more. They're famous for their diverse selection of premium quality grafted pawpaw trees. 5-star Google ratings and customer testimonials attest to their commitment to excellence in quality and service. Find them at peacefulheritage.com and join their mailing list. Once again, find them at peacefulheritage.com. Use the promo code NOTILL, all caps, one word, for 10% off your first order. All right, back to the show. If you, the listener, are enjoying this content, getting even a small amount of value of it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere that questions come in, but I will always get to those Patreon questions now. Today's Patreon question comes from Patreon member Tom Beatty, who writes, quote, "Hey Jesse, I have a question about cover cropping and interplanting. I live in the Blackland Prairie of Texas, Zone 8B, and have a small backyard garden. Our soil is a black clay that, if left uncovered, compacts and cracks terribly. Because of this, I've been thinking of maintaining a cover crop between my rows year-round." I suppose this gets into living pathway territory. "I also like the idea of having this cover crop between my plants in the rows themselves. I've noticed that the soil between my plants from a crust, due to high clay content and water, tends to run off more than infiltrate. I'm thinking white clover might fit the bill. It does well here year-round and can be kept short by mowing. My thought is to plant my entire bed in clover, then, when it's time for planting, leave the clover in place and transplant into it. I figure I can mow the clover to keep it under control, then possibly cultivate a small area around each transplant. I found a study that discussed something similar in corn crops, but recommended terminating a strip of the clover, either via tillage, tarping, or spraying, to plant into. I'm thinking about clearing only enough space for each transplant, though. I realize the answer to my issue might just be mulch, but I'm interested in using a living nitrogen fixer. What do you think? Any knowledge or ideas on how my idea might work out? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Thanks." End quote. All right, so great questions there, Tom. And this is obviously something I've put a lot of time into, but also something that I have to deal with, as our clays seem like maybe they're cousins. Anyway, I've said this before, but my answer to perennial cover cropping is indeed just living pathways coupled with mulched beds. Now, I will say, and this is pretty interesting, my buddy Eric Nordell sent me a webinar a couple years ago by a guy named Lincoln Fishman of Sawyer Farm in Massachusetts, who plants vegetables directly into Dutch white clover with success, like perhaps a slightly more conventional form of what Fukuoka describes in One Straw Revolution. I will link that that seminar, in the show notes because it's worth a watch. But what Lincoln says is that transferred mulches, like physically bringing in and spreading the amount of mulch he would need, are not an option for him on his scale. So he had to come up with an alternative, and planting directly into Dutch white clover has worked for him. I will say, from my vantage, I would still lean more on the mulches because harvest looks like it would be significantly harder with clover in the way, at least on our scale. Planting would be somewhat difficult. He usually does almost like a strip down the middle. And density would also be a little bit lower. Like you couldn't plant beds super, super dense in that system and maximize a small space. But I do think it's a pretty cool system. I mean, there's certainly room for systems like that to be developed. pretty much no matter where you live. Anyway, I'm not going to critique his system too much from afar, so I suggest you all watch that seminar and kind of get your own ideas for it. It's certainly interesting, especially on a larger scale for certain crops, to kind of think about planting directly into living clovers. So anyway, the issue with clover is that, and this is especially true in warmer climates with longer seasons, the grass is going to come through eventually in the season. If you could mow or weed whack the clover really, really high, you could potentially delay that effect, but the reality is that although clover grows all season, it really only thrives on the shoulder seasons in a warm climate. So the soil would be happier, almost without question, but also the planting would be harder. The harvest would also be harder. The yields might not be as high. So it's a balance. For us, it's easier to maintain mulch if you're on a small scale. And that speaks to your admission that mulch is probably the answer. I mean, mulch is probably the answer to cracking and drying out of the soil. At least that's part of the answer. Another part is simply building up the organic matter as much as possible with cover crops and composts. Often in Texas, you all go through a 2-month period where growing food is really tough in the middle of the summer. Cover crops could make at least a little bit of a difference there. Also, in terms of adding like hay, like alfalfa hay, or something low in weed seeds like straw, you have the advantage of using that early in the season in a way northern growers can't always get away with it, generally because it slows down their production in the spring. Now, to that point, I've seen people argue that Ruth Stout, who really popularized those lightly colored mulches, grew in a northern climate, but here's the thing. Ruth Stout lived in a semi-northern latitude in Redding, Connecticut, but not a northern climate. Her ag hardiness zone would have been the same as mine here in Kentucky, zone 6B, where we're right on the cusp of being able to get away with using those cool colored mulches in the early spring. It almost keeps the soil too cool for too long. In a southern climate, cooler soils are helpful through most of the year, so cooler, lightly colored mulches might be less work and more beneficial. Plus, you could potentially grow your own in the form of cover crops that you terminate in the late summer and plant into when it's warm in most soils, but cool under the mulch of the cover crop residue. The living pathways are totally up to you, but the mulch and the driving of that organic matter are going to be really helpful to production and keeping that cracking from happening if you can swing them. And you almost certainly do not want to battle living pathways out of unmulched beds, so that may not be the ideal option for you in your particular situation. Let me know if you have any other further questions, Tom, or anyone else on the Patreon page. Like I always say, living pathways are not for everyone and not without their challenges. Watch and listen to everything we've done on them. They cannot just be added willy-nilly or any other type of nilly. So, dear listener, just make sure that you hear that part. All right, up next, let's talk weeds. Be right back. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Harnwah Greenhouses. Harnwah Greenhouses has pioneered controlled environment agriculture since 1965, partnering with market gardeners and farmers across North America to deliver turnkey greenhouse solutions. Their unwavering mission is to support growers' success through innovation and expertise in design, manufacturing, and installation. Harnwah Greenhouses are engineered to withstand high wind and snow loads, providing optimal brightness, increased yields, rapid ROI, and long-lasting durability. With over 20,000 projects completed, they are more than a manufacturer. They are a trusted partner. Their structures foster sustainable, energy-efficient ecosystems that drive profitable, resilient agriculture. In 2025, Harnwah is introducing a new low-tech, high-tunnel model starting at just $2 per square foot, offering open field growers an accessible entry into controlled environment agriculture. Harnwah Greenhouses, leading the way in turnkey solutions for local growers. Learn more at harnwah.com. That's HARNOIS.com. All right, back to the show. All right, so I saw a comment recently, and forgive me, I can't for the life of me track it down for attribution. But anyway, I recently saw a comment that said this person had good success using weeds as a cover crop. And I've seen folks say stuff about weeds like that before. So let's talk about weeds and using weeds and allowing weeds to grow, because I think people don't always get the best advice about this stuff. And it's advice that can frankly devastate your garden. I'm not going to bury the lead here. Until you have many years of growing experience, I would not even think about intentionally using weeds in your production or allowing them to grow. What I would suggest is you do everything you can in the first few years to keep weeds from growing and going to seed. Get in regular routine of keeping weeds in check and cultivating and or mulching. Learn the weeds of your region, learn their habits, when they germinate, how they grow, how fast they flower, etc. learn how to control them, what works and what doesn't. With emphasis, weeds are not to be messed with. Pigweed, for instance, can put down tens of thousands of seeds per plant, or even hundreds of thousands. And then those seeds can survive 5 or more years in the soil, so one plant can cause half a decade of trouble. The roots of certain grasses like Bermuda and Johnson grass can extend and grow quietly underground, and then as they become severed, they create new plants. Chickweed has tricky, tiny flowers that load up with seeds very quickly in the spring and can take over a fall garden rapidly. So, until you know exactly how your weeds work, you should not think about just letting them grow. Now, someone may say, but indigenous people allow weeds in their gardens, which yes, but also they know those plants extremely well, even cultivated many of them. I mean, why do you think amaranths like pigweed have so many seeds? It's brilliant. But if you don't understand the plant, it can be a massive problem in the garden, limiting production and greatly complicating your gardening endeavors. Weeds are a very common reason people give up on their gardens, and I don't want that for anyone. Rather, what I would recommend is to put a lot of effort into developing a weed management strategy that starts at the very beginning of the garden's life, either with deep compost mulches and or a very long tarping. For some perennial grasses and rhizomatous weeds, that could mean tarping for a year or more before ever planting anything. Then, depending on what growing methods you choose, weed management requires vigilance. When I learned to farm, I learned to cultivate after every rain. I learned how to stale seedbed. I learned how to harrow. And above all, I learned to address weeds at bud stage, because as they get bigger, they get harder to deal with. So all that to say, is there a place for weeds in the garden? Sure, there can be. If I know the weed is not going to get anywhere near going to seed or spreading, and I'm about to clear that bed or something, I won't freak out about it because it's feeding the soil. But I'm able to do that because I know my weeds really well. However, you will not run into many, if any, professional growers who would ever employ weeds for any amount of time intentionally. Even my living pathways, controlled as they are risky, but I take that risk because I know the plants really well and I know how to manage the weeds. Not saying growers don't exist who strategically utilize weeds. Who knows? They're the person who originally wrote that comment. They clearly use weeds as a cover crop and may depend on their garden for their livelihood. But I guarantee that person and any other grower who uses weeds knows their weeds really well. Ecologically speaking, certainly. Weeds are great for the soil because they keep the soil fed and covered and in place, adds a little biodiversity, but ideally you choose the plants doing that work, because if you don't, then nature will. And I'm just going to be honest, she doesn't care a whole heck of a lot about profitability or productivity. So there's that. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on weeds or anything else I ever talk about or don't talk about. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at No-Till Growers. Also shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music that you are hearing. Pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook or the Seed Farmer at notillgrowers.com to support our work. Also, here is a QR code if you would like to apply for the position of editor/producer of this show. That link will be in the show notes as well. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/notillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or sign up in the month of January, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to our weeklies. Alex and Oliver, Maina, Stacy Moorman, always enjoy that one. Bill King, Chris Yates, and Stephen Smith. This week, the weeklies they've decided to do they've set up like an amazing race, right? Like they're kind of competing to get across the country. The first one there wins their own dolphin. But the catch is that they have to do this on one of those sort of, what do they call them? The self-balancing segways. And so it's really a story not just of triumph and endurance, but of humility. So anyway, thanks for watching and or listening. We will see you tomorrow. Yeah, bye.